It came during a Sunday FaceTime call, and I could tell from the way my daughter paused before she said it that she'd been sitting on it for weeks. She said, "Dad, if you and her get serious, what happens to the house in Kitchener?" I didn't answer right away. Not because I had a plan I was hiding. I hadn't thought that far ahead at all. But, sitting there on my balcony with the ceiling fan turning and the sound of a temple bell carrying up from the street below, I realized I was thousands of kilometers from my kids, and I had nothing useful to say. I was 68 years old. I had moved to Chiang Mai 14 months earlier, and for the first time since my wife passed, I was seeing someone. My daughter is Julia. She's 41, lives in Toronto, works in HR. She's practical to the point of being blunt, and I raised her that way, so I couldn't be too surprised when she went straight to the money question. But I got defensive anyway. I told her the house money had nothing to do with anything yet. I told her I hadn't thought about any of that. Then I said something I probably shouldn't have. Can I just have one thing in my life that isn't a line item on a spreadsheet? She went quiet. Not angry quiet, worse, careful quiet. When the call ended, I sat there knowing I'd taken one uncomfortable question and turned it into something that was going to be harder to walk back. The strange thing was, 6 months earlier, none of this would have been a conversation worth having. When I left Canada, I wasn't going to Thailand to find anyone. I want to make that clear because I know how it sounds. Older man moves overseas, meets a local woman. I know what people assume. That wasn't my story. After Eleanor died, I went through the motions for about 2 years, stayed in the house, kept up with the neighbors, went to the hockey games my son Michael flew in for in November. I wasn't falling apart, I was managing. But managing isn't living, and somewhere around the second winter alone, the kind of February in Ontario that makes you wonder why anyone settled there in the first place, I started thinking differently. I had my CPP, my OAS, a decent amount in my RRIF from 40 years as an electrician, nothing extravagant. But I started running the numbers on what that money could actually do in Southeast Asia versus what it barely covered in Kitchener. The math made sense, the weather made sense. The idea of not spending another March staring at gray slush made a lot of sense. I told my kids it was just for a year. That was also what I told myself. The first several months in Chiang Mai were about adjusting. I found a place near the Niman area, figured out how to get around, got used to eating things I couldn't name, and learned which street vendors were consistent and which ones you smiled at and kept walking. It was a quieter life than Canada, but it didn't feel small. It felt like space I hadn't known I was missing. Then I met Juan. I'll use her full name once, Juan Pen, but she goes by Juan, and that's what I'll use. She was 52 at the time, divorced for about 8 years. She had 2 grown children, a son in Bangkok and a daughter up in Chiang Mai. She ran a small cafe near the old city, the kind of place that had been there long enough that regular customers had their own mugs on a shelf by the window. We met in about the least significant way 2 people can meet. I was lost trying to find a hardware store. I stopped at her cafe to ask directions. She didn't just point. She drew me a rough map on the back of a receipt and told me which turn most tourists missed. I thanked her and left. The hardware store was exactly where she said it would be. I went back the next day for coffee. Not to see her specifically. Or at least that's what I told myself. She remembered me, which was either good memory or I looked more lost than I thought. We talked for about 10 minutes. She had work to do, and so did I, if you count walking the moat road as work. A week later, I was back again. This time we talked longer. She asked what I was doing so far from home. I gave the usual answer: retirement, the cold, the exchange rate. She laughed at the exchange rate part and said most Canadians she'd met gave the same 3 reasons in the same order. I asked if she wanted to get dinner sometime. She said she finished at the cafe at 6 and that she'd eaten dinner at 6 for 15 years. I said 6 worked for me. That was the beginning of it. I didn't tell my kids for almost 2 months. Not because I was hiding anything. I genuinely didn't know what I was hiding. We were having dinner once or twice a week. Juan was teaching me enough Thai that I could embarrass myself politely instead of rudely. I was learning which of her regulars she liked and which ones she was patient with for other reasons. It felt easy in a way I had forgotten things could feel. But eventually, I had to say something. I waited for a Sunday when both Julia and Michael had time, which meant 8 in the morning for me and 7 at night for my son in Calgary. We talked about regular things first. Julia's renovation, Michael's youngest starting grade 1, a leaky tap I'd sorted in my apartment. Then I said there was something else. I said I'd been spending time with someone. My son said, like a friend? I said, more than that, I think. There was a pause. Then Julia said, how long? I said, almost 2 months. Michael asked how old she was. I said 52. He said, so 16 years younger. I said yes. He didn't say anything else right away, but I heard him shift in his chair. Julia asked where she was from, that she lived in Chiang Mai, that she had her own business and her own family. Julia asked if she had kids. I said yes, 2, both grown. Julia asked if she'd been married before. I said yes, divorced 8 years. Then Michael asked the question I'd been half expecting. Has she asked you for anything? I said no. He said not yet, or just not so far. Those 2 words sat there like something dropped on a glass table. I told him she had never once brought up money. I told him that when the refrigerator at her cafe broke down and she mentioned it in passing, just mentioning it, not asking, I offered to help cover part of the repair. She told me it wasn't my problem. She sorted it herself within the week. I thought that would settle things temporarily. It didn't. Julia said they weren't trying to upset me. She said they'd read enough stories online. I said I understood. Then I told her Juan wasn't a story. She was a person I had coffee with, who laughed at the same things I laughed at, who had a full life before I showed up and wasn't sitting around waiting for someone to rescue her. Julia said, we don't know that, Dad. I got irritated. I told her she was judging someone she'd never met based on things she'd seen on the internet. That was a mistake. Julia didn't raise her voice. She said, I'm trying to protect you. I said I didn't need protecting. Then Michael said quietly, maybe we should just leave this for now, and that was more or less how the call ended. After that, I stopped bringing Juan up much. I was tired of feeling like I had to defend something that hadn't done anything wrong. Meanwhile, the 2 of us just kept going. We weren't talking about the future in any specific way. We each had our own place. We saw each other 3 or 4 times a week. If I had a rough day, and some days were rough, being that far from everything familiar, she was easy to talk to, not because she fixed anything, but because she listened without already having an answer ready. Then one afternoon she asked me something I hadn't expected. She said, do your children know about me? I said yes. She said, are they happy for you? I didn't answer right away. She looked at me and said, that's an answer. So I told her the truth. I told her they were worried. I told her they'd ask about money. I waited for her to get her back up. She didn't. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, if my daughter told me she was dating a foreign man I had never met, I would ask questions too. I said, does it bother you? She said, a little, but they are your children. They are supposed to worry about you. Then she said something I've turned over many times since. She said, I don't want your money. I want your company. Those are not the same thing. That should have made everything simpler. For a few weeks it did. Then Julia called on her own, not during a group call, just her. And she didn't ask about Juan's business or her history. She asked me something different. She said, Dad, what happens to your savings if something happens to you? I had sold the house in Kitchener before I left. I want to be clear about that. I wasn't sitting on an empty property, and the proceeds were sitting in my TFSA and split across my RIF. Along with my pension, that was the bulk of what I had. My will left everything equally to Julia and Michael. It had been written that way since before Eleanor got sick, and I hadn't changed a word. I told Julia all of that. She said, "I know what it says now. I'm asking if you're planning to change it." I told her I hadn't planned to change anything. She said, "If things get serious with Juan, if you got married, would you include her?" I said I didn't know. She went quiet, then she said, "That's what worries me." I asked what she meant by that. She said, "You've known her less than a year. You're in another country. We have no way to see what your life actually looks like over there. And now you're telling us it's getting serious, but you haven't thought through what that means for any of the practical stuff." I said, "It's my money, Julia." She said, "I know it is." That stopped me. She wasn't demanding anything. She wasn't saying she was owed something. She was saying she was scared I was going to make a large decision too fast, and if I was being honest with myself, I had a history of that. Not with relationships. Eleanor and I had been married 34 years. But in general, when I got it in my head that something was the right move, I committed quickly. The decision to move to Thailand had gone from first thought to landing at Suvarnabhumi in under 5 months. Julia knew that about me. She asked one more question before she let it go. She said, "If you married her next year, would she be in your will?" I stared at the wall of my apartment. I said, "I honestly don't know." She said, "Okay. No fight, no yelling." She said goodnight, and that was it. I kept turning it over after that. If Juan and I were together for years and I died without acknowledging that, was that fair? But if I changed my will after knowing her for less than a year, wouldn't my kids be right to be alarmed? I'd never had to think about a relationship in those terms before. When you're 35, you think about whether you want the same things, whether you can build something together. At 68, there's a third question in the room. What happens when one of you isn't there anymore? I told Juan about the call a few days later. We were eating at a restaurant she liked near the Saturday walking street. I set down my fork and told her what Julia had asked. Juan put her fork down too. She looked at me and said, "Are you?" I said I didn't know. She said, "Why would you change it for me?" She wasn't asking it angrily. She was asking it like the answer was obvious. Your children are your children. What you built before me belongs to your family. I told her it wasn't quite that simple. She said, "It can be simple if you let it." I almost laughed. I asked, "That's it?" She said, "What else do you want me to say? I'm not with you so I can wait for you to die. That's a terrible reason to have dinner with someone." I didn't know what to say to that. I felt a little embarrassed. Not because I'd accused her of anything directly, but because I'd let everyone else's fear take up space in my head. Juan hadn't earned that suspicion. She'd done nothing but be consistent, patient, and honest, and I'd let the worry I heard in my kids' voices color the way I looked at her. I decided I needed to stop guessing and start doing something concrete. I wanted my kids to meet Juan in person, not on a screen. Either things would get better or they would get harder. But at least we'd all be working with real information. The problem was Julia had already told me she had no interest in flying to Thailand. Too far, too hot, too expensive was how she'd put it. My son Michael hadn't said much either way. About 3 months later, Julia sent me a text. "I've been looking at flights to Chiang Mai. What month works for you?" I read it twice before I called her. I said, "You're serious?" She said, "I've been thinking about it for a while. I want to see it for myself." I knew what she meant. She wanted to see how I was actually living. Not the version I described on Sunday calls, the real version. She wanted to meet Juan in a setting she could observe honestly. Honestly, part of me was relieved. I'd been describing my life in Thailand for over a year, and words weren't doing the job. We found dates that worked around her schedule. She booked 2 weeks, which surprised me. I'd expected 10 days at most. I was at arrivals when she came through the doors. It had been 14 months since I'd stood next to one of my kids. That landed harder than I expected. She looked tired from the travel. but she smiled when she saw me and said, "Okay, it's even hotter than you said." I said, "Give it a day." On the drive back, she had questions. Was the hospital far? Did I have a local doctor? Was the neighborhood safe at night? What happened if the power went out for an extended stretch? I answered what I could. A few of the questions I genuinely never thought through, which I probably shouldn't have admitted out loud. The first day I let her sleep and adjust. The next morning, Juan came over. I was more nervous than I wanted to admit. Juan knew Julia had concerns. Julia knew Juan knew. There was no pretending this was a casual visit. All three of us walked into that room understanding exactly what the room meant. It was awkward at first. Juan was warm but careful. Julia was polite but guarded. I made tea just to have something to do with my hands. Then Juan asked Julia about the flight. Julia asked Juan about the cafe. They started talking without me needing to steer anything, and I felt something ease slightly in my chest. We went out for lunch at a place Juan knew that wasn't tourist-priced, but wasn't so local that Julia would be overwhelmed on her second day in the country. I spent most of the meal watching them more than eating. Juan didn't perform anything. She didn't make a case for herself or try to win a trial she wasn't supposed to know she was in. She was just herself, the same way she was with her regulars every morning. At some point I excused myself. When I came back, the two of them were in the middle of something and both laughed when I sat down. I didn't ask what. Later that evening, back at my place, I asked Julia what they talked about while I was away. She said, "I asked her what she liked about you." I said, "That's a brave question." Julia said, "She gave a good answer." I asked what it was. Julia thought for a moment. She said you're a slow thinker, that you don't rush to have an opinion about things. She said most men she's known decided everything before she finished a sentence. I said, "A slow thinker, that's flattering." Julia said, "I think she meant it as one. It wasn't about money or what I could provide or where I was from. It was something Juan had noticed about the way I listened. That seemed to matter to my daughter. I could tell from the way she said it." Over the following week, I showed Julia my actual life in Chiang Mai. Not temples and cooking classes. My regular grocery market, the coffee place I went to most mornings, the park I walked through before the heat settled in, the little restaurant where they knew my order before I sat down. She met my neighbor Claude, a retired teacher from Quebec who'd been there 4 years and showed no signs of leaving. She saw that I wasn't sitting in my apartment waiting for Juan to come rescue me from loneliness. I had a life here, a quiet one but mine. But she also saw things I'd stopped seeing. One evening she asked what I would do if I had a medical emergency and Juan wasn't reachable. I said I'd call for help. She said, "Who exactly?" I had a number for a clinic I'd been to once for a stomach thing. I hadn't registered with the Canadian Embassy. My travel insurance was solid, but my kids didn't have the policy number or the name of the insurer. My provincial health coverage, which I'd maintained during the first year I was abroad, had lapsed, and I hadn't decided what to replace it with. Another afternoon she asked about my important documents. Will, passport, bank information, that sort of thing. I said they were in a folder in my desk drawer. She said, "Dad, that's not a plan, that's just a drawer." I wanted to argue. I didn't. She was right. I had moved halfway across the world and handled the parts that felt urgent when I arrived. The apartment, the long-stay visa, the bank account. I hadn't handled the parts that only feel urgent when something goes wrong. By the middle of her second week, the tension had come out of our conversations. She stopped asking leading questions. I stopped bracing for them. We were just talking the way we used to before all of this started. Then, 2 nights before she was supposed to fly home, she asked if we could sit down alone. No Juan, just us. Her face told me this wasn't going to be light. She said, "I need to tell you something." My stomach tightened. I thought she'd seen something I'd missed. Something Juan had said. something she'd observed over 2 weeks that confirmed what she'd come worried about. I said, "What happened?" She said, "Nothing happened." A pause. "I like her." I just looked at my daughter. She said, "I came here ready to find the thing that was wrong. I thought she'd be performing something. I thought you'd be covering for everything and not seeing it clearly. I thought you'd gotten lonely and made a decision that was going to end up costing you." That was hard to hear said plainly, even though I'd known she thought those things. Then she said, "I don't see any of that." I let out a breath I hadn't noticed I was holding. She said Juan seemed like the same person in every room, that she hadn't tried to steer anything or manage me in front of Julia, that she'd seen the way Juan talked to her regulars at the cafe versus how she talked to someone she was just meeting, and it was the same person each time. Then Julia said, "But I'm still worried about you." I almost laughed. I said, "Of course you are." She said, "Not because of her, because of you." She walked me through it. No clear emergency contacts established locally beyond Juan. Documents not organized in any way that would help my kids if they needed to manage something from Canada on short notice. My bank still had my old Kitchener address. My will hadn't been reviewed by a lawyer since Eleanor died. No healthcare directive, no list of accounts. None of that had anything to do with Juan. All of it would have been true whether I was seeing someone or not. I'd moved to the other side of the world and taken care of the visible parts and ignored the infrastructure underneath. Then she brought up the money question again. This time I didn't go stiff. She said, "Dad, I'm not sitting in Toronto counting your RRIF. Michael isn't either. We're both fine." She paused. "What scared me was thinking you might make decisions because you were trying to prove something to us, not because they were actually what you wanted." I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "You were so defensive every time we ask about Juan that I think you started treating every concern like an attack, even the ones that were just us being scared." She was right. I'd been so focused on proving I wasn't making a mistake that I'd stopped asking myself whether everything was actually in order. My kids hadn't been wrong to wonder. They'd just been wrong to assume the worst, and I'd been wrong to stop listening the moment they asked hard questions. I asked Julia what she thought I should actually do. She said, "Call a lawyer back in Canada, not to rewrite everything tonight, just to get things organized. Make sure your wishes are clear. Make sure Michael and I know where everything is and what to do if something happens when we're 12,000 kilometers away." She said, "And if things keep going well with Juan, then you update things as your life changes. That's what people do." The next day I told Juan about the conversation. She listened all the way through without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "Your daughter is smart." I said, "Don't tell her that. I'll never hear the end of it." Juan smiled. Then I asked her something I'd been circling around for a long time. I said, "If we stay together, if we eventually get more serious, what do you expect from me, financially?" She looked at me steadily for a moment. Then she said, "I expect you to be honest with me, and I expect us to talk before either of us makes a big decision that affects both of us." I said, "That's it?" She said, "That's actually quite a lot." It was, and it made more sense than anything else I'd been trying to untangle. The morning Julia left, I drove her to Chiang Mai International. Before she went through the doors, she hugged me for longer than usual. Then she pulled back and said, "I'm not asking you to come home." I said, "I know." She said, "Just get your stuff in order." I told her I would. For once, I meant it without having to think about it. 2 weeks later, I called a lawyer in Kitchener, a woman my old neighbor had used for his estate planning, and explained my situation from Thailand on a slightly delayed video call. She was straightforward about all of it. We went through what I owned, what my wishes actually were, who should have authority over things if I became unable to handle them myself, and whether I had a healthcare directive in place. She didn't make it feel dramatic or urgent in a bad way. It was just practical. I needed practical. Afterward, I sat down and organized that drawer Julia had called out. I put my documents in order. I wrote down my account information, my insurance policy details, the name and number of the international clinic I'd registered with, the address of the Canadian consulate in Chiang Mai, and a list of the people in Thailand who knew me well enough to be useful in an emergency. I sent copies to both my kids. Julia replied within an hour. This is all I ever wanted. Michael sent a thumbs up. Then, a few minutes later, a longer message. He said he was glad I was happy. He said he was sorry he'd been short with me at the start of all this. That was more from my son in writing than I usually get, so I read it twice and saved it. Juan came by while I was finishing the last of the paperwork. She looked at the documents spread across the kitchen table and said, "Did your daughter organize all this from Toronto?" I said, "Pretty much." She said, "She loves you." I said, "I know. She just shows it by asking about my estate planning." Juan laughed. Then she sat down across from me and asked if I was okay. I said I was, and I meant it. A few months have passed since Julia's visit. Juan and I are still together. We don't live in the same place, and we're not engaged. I'm not in a hurry about any of that. At 68, it's easy to feel like you have to make every decision at once, because you don't know how many years you have left to course correct. I've been trying to resist that pressure. Rushing something that's already working has never made it better. Julia asks about Juan now when we talk on Sundays. Sometimes Juan waves at the screen for a minute if she's there when I call. Michael is still quieter about it. He's always been the one who processes things slowly and says less than he's thinking. But the sharp questions have stopped, and I don't get my back up when he does ask something. I still think about what Julia said in that first uncomfortable call. About the savings, about the will, about whether I'd thought it through. At the time I heard it as an accusation, like she was drawing a boundary between my old life and my new one, telling me which side she was on. But that wasn't what she was doing. She was asking if I'd actually thought it through. She was asking if the man she'd relied on to make good decisions her whole life was still making them. I hadn't been, not fully. My kids know where things stand now. Juan knows where she stands. My lawyer knows what I want. My documents are in one place, organized, and my kids know where to find them. If something happened to me tomorrow, the people I care about would not be left sorting through a mess. But when I think about what I actually have here, the real version, not the paperwork, it isn't any of that. It's Tuesday mornings at Juan's Cafe before the first regulars arrive, when the city is still quiet, and she's going through receipts, and I'm reading, and nobody needs to say anything. It's the way she corrects my Thai pronunciation in public without embarrassing me, which takes more skill than it sounds. It's having someone to walk through the Sunday market with who knows what things are actually supposed to cost, and will tell me when I'm being taken for a tourist. Those are small things. I know how they sound. But after 3 years of getting through days instead of living them, small things feel like more than enough. I didn't come to Thailand looking for a relationship. I came because I was tired of February. Juan was just someone who drew me a map on the back of a receipt, and 1 week turned into another. Maybe we'll get married someday. Maybe we won't. I've stopped trying to answer that question before it's ready to be answered. My kids still worry about me. Juan still tells me when I'm being stubborn, and I'm still figuring out how to hold all of it at the same time. That's enough for now. If you were in Julia's position, would you have asked about the money?